You can see that Lemmic has detected changes into our blogs model, and it's generating a migration file. So now that we have our migration file, we can run the migration to migrate run. So migrate revert. And you can see that it downgraded our migration. All this needs is a title. So hello world. So we created the blog hello world. We can refresh the database and see that it has been created. It has the correct title, URL path, ID of 1, and created at timestamp. So this is part 2 of building a semi-static blog in FastAPI. Last time we got started with FastAPI and built some basic components that we will build off today. So our agenda for today is first we're going to add an async SQLite database. Then afterwards we will add a migration tool called Lemmic. And then we'll create a blog model for the database. And lastly, we'll create an API to update, save, and delete a blog. So you might be wondering why I'm using SQLite and not something like Postgres. And well, that's because I think SQLite is easier to work with as it's just a file. Less infrastructure, less complicated. I don't really want to spend like 15 minutes trying to explain how to set up Postgres for the people that's never tried it before. But you can use async Postgres if you want. The ORM makes the query and models pretty much the same. All right, so let's first install some packages. So activating my virtual environment, I will install a few packages. First is SQL model. The next is AIO SQLite, and the last one is Lemmic. So we will be using SQL model for our ORM, which is pretty much SQL Alchemy mixed with Pydantic. Kind of look that up right now. Sorry, this is a little bit bright for a moment, but yeah, SQL model is just pretty much Pydantic and SQL Alchemy. If you've ever used Flask before, then you might be more familiar with how to set this up, as Flask's primary ORM is SQL Alchemy. Now moving on to AIO SQLite. This is just an interface for async SQLite. We need to manually install this because the default interface that Python comes with is not async. And then Lemmic is just our migration manager tool that we can use to sync our database model classes with our database. Okay, so let's add to our script that we made from our last video, part 1. So this is our script here in app. You can pause here to see what's going on at your own pace, but just to go over these briefly, this entire script is pretty much, an argument parser. What I pretty much added here is just the migrate section. So if I run app space migrate space init, then it makes the scaffolding like config files and stuff for the whole migration system. And it runs this command here. And then if we do add, this will pretty much add a migration file to our migration list. So it'll be like add and then a name for the kind of name or tag for the migration. So like say you updated the blog models, you can just write like update blog or something like that. And then if we do run, it'll run the migration. So any new migration files that it detects, like say we just added update blog, it'll run that migration and update the database. And then revert is to revert back one migration as specified here. So that's just our script to help us easily access these commands without needing to memorize all of these long commands. All we need to do is run the script, pass in migrate, and then one of these arguments here. So like as an example, we could just do something like app migrate run, and it'll just run the migrations for us. So this is pretty much similar to what Django does with its manage.py. I think manage.py also contains some migration commands as well. So let's use our script that we just made, and we can init our migration system. So it was migrate init. And you can see it created a lot of the scaffolding for us. So here we get a new file called lemmic.ini. And then you can also see that we have a migrations folder here as well, which will contain more config files and also contain our migrations list in the versions folder. So after initializing our migration system, we can add models. So we can make a quick DB model of a blog. Right now we have, this is our directory, and we want to organize stuff to put it into a models folder. And in the models folder, we'll also make another folder called DB, which will specify that it's a DB model. Because later on, I think I'll add more different models that we'll use that's not database related. So we can add a new file to DB called blog.py. But yeah, I'll pretty much just write up the code here and kind of briefly go over what's going on. So first we'll just make a base for the model. And this is just going to contain our fields that are mostly dynamic. So I think we want like a title, right? Title, and then we want the URL path. This URL path is pretty much what determines the URL path of our blog. So say like we have like a testing 7 blog, right? It's gonna be like localhost 8000 because we're doing a local, and then blog, and then this portion right here is gonna be this URL path. We also need to import SQL model, import model. And I kind of want to make defaults for the field. So we also want to import the field. I want a unique title for each model. This is currently how you make it unique. I know it's a little bit weird, but I think they will probably fix this later on in newer versions of SQL model. And for your URL path, a default of empty string. Okay, so we have our base. Now we want our main model. So block base. So this class right here is going to determine our table in the database. And we can change the database table name like this with this attribute in the class. If you wanted to make it like plural, then you do blogs. Actually, yeah, let's demonstrate this instead. So I'm going to rename it to blogs. And then it's going to have an ID of an integer. So primary key. So this will auto increment the ID every time we make a new model. Also need to import typing as well. And I also want to make a created at field. And it's going to have a date time type. And it's going to have a default of when it was created in UTC. So datetime.now time zone.utc. So you can create a category label, right? So you wanted to make like a category, right? For folder optimization, because like you don't want to store all the blogs in one folder, right? But just for demo's sake, I want to keep things really simple. So I won't add the category, but just do note that you could add category to kind of improve the folder system. Okay, so let's save that. And then kind of want to use the models DB folder as like a package. So I will make a init file in that folder. So in DB, we just need to import it in this file here. And this will pretty much import it into this init so that we can use it like this. So we can use it like this line right here in other files. This not only helps us make the imports look more cleaner, but also helps us with our imports in our migration system, because we can just import everything in this file instead of doing it one by one, which we will see pretty soon. So now let's modify our Alemic ini file. So in here we want to set our thing right here, our SQL Alchemy URL, into the async version of SQLite, and then our database file name. You can kind of look at the instructions for other databases like Postgres on the docs, but for this project we'll be using SQLite. So we save this, and then next let's go into our migrations folder and into our env.py. So this env.py is pretty much what will make Alemic target our SQL model instead of the default SQL Alchemy model, as you can see here. So the target metadata is pretty much what I mentioned earlier. So in the blog.py, right? So in here, this SQL model is being inherited. This parent class is how Alemic will find all of the database models in your project. So here we want to set SQL model instead of the base of SQL Alchemy model. So what we do here is we want to import SQL model. In here, we use SQL model.metadata. So then now we have our SQL model hooked up to Alemic. And then we also want to import all of our models. So in here, as I mentioned earlier in the init file, right, we can do model from models.db, we can import star, which will import all of our models. So say we have like blog and user model, it'll import everything in here. If we didn't have the init file, it'd be like import blog, right? And then if we had like user, it'll be like import user, right? And we don't want to like just keep doing it like this and keep adding on and on and on, right? We just want to import everything. So import the models, right? So now Alemic will look for every imported model to see which one is inheriting the target metadata. And then from there, it's going to track which models has changed. And then it can make migration files for us depending on what has changed in those models. So pretty much all of this setup is to, so we save this. We also want to edit one more config file, which is our script.py.mako. And all we need to do here is import SQL model, because it'll be using SQL model instead of SQL Alchemy whenever we make our migration files. Okay, so now that we have everything set up, we can add a migration file. So with our script that we made earlier, we can do migrate add and something like initial migration, something like this. You can see that Alemic has detected changes into our blogs model, and it's generating a migration file in our versions folder, which is where our migrations list is. So now that we have our migration file, we can run the migration to migrate run. And then this will insert and update all of our table and columns depending on what this file has in here. Actually, we can just kind of see what's going on in here. So you can see that on the upgrade, which is when we run the migration, it's going to create a table. And then in that table, it's going to create the columns that we have in our model. So now you can use any DB tool you are used to, but I'm using dbeaver here to peek into our database. Yeah, so let's make a new connection. So this database 2 is our, because I have another database with the same name, but this 2 is our project here. And you can see that in our tables, we have a blogs table. And you can see that this blogs table is reflective of how we named our table earlier. So in db.blog, you can see here that our table name is blogs, right? Normally it would just be blog, all lowercase, but we have a specific name for it here. And then you can see our columns that are pretty much what we made here. We have a title, URL path, ID, and created at. And yeah, if you want to revert changes to the database, I can kind of demonstrate that really quick. We pretty much just need to do the revert method that we made in our script, right? So migrate, revert. And you can see that it downgraded our migration. So in dbeaver, you can kind of refresh the table and see that our blogs table is gone. And actually, this is where Alemic keeps track of the version number. Say that right now it's like there's nothing, right? Say that we try to run our migration again. Actually, sorry, I want to kind of show how to manage the migration files as well. Since we just downgraded or reverted our migration, right? Usually that migration file will still be there. In versions, you can see that our migration file is still here, that our initial migration file, even though we reverted the changes. So what you would want to actually do after reverting changes is remove that specific migration file. So you want to remove that. We have nothing in here. So you want to add a migration again, right? So migrate add. We can make a different name this time, like init blogs. And now we have a migration file again. And then we can run the migration. You can actually, let me go back here and pull this up. You can actually see here that we don't have the version yet until we run the migration. So we run the migration, right? And then it's going to bring the version in. And then you'll see that our table is going to be repopulated our blogs tables back. So that's how our migrations work pretty much. So we've learned how to initialize the migration, right? We do migrate init, and then we add a migration, and then we run the migration. And then we've also learned how to revert the migration as well. And just note that after reverting, you want to go into the migrations folder, into the migrations list in versions, right? And then remove the file after reverting. All right, so next let's create our async DB client that would be used in our FastAPI routes. But before that, I want to make a config file for our project, kind of like Django's config.py. Actually, let's name it config.py. And so this config file will contain everything, mostly static data. And what this does here is that it's going to create a single instance of the config whenever we run the application. And this database URL should be the same as the one in our ini file right here. So this should be the same as the config. So back to the client file. Let's make a directory called database. So now we have a directory called this is where all of our database stuff for FastAPI is going to live. And then in database, we'll make a client file. So in here, we will have two different types of sessions. The first one is going to be a get session base, and this is going to return a session maker object. So here I'm going to import our async session. This is our async database object pretty much. And then this is our create engine, which is going to be creating our engine for the database. And it's just for typing. And then we have our config file. So this is just some options that I saw when trying to make a async database connection. I'm not entirely sure what it does. I kind of just briefly skimmed over this from an issues tab and I ran into an issue. But yeah, let's create our engine. Create async engine. So our URL is going to be URL. This is our database file. True. Connect args equals connect args. Actually, we did need that session maker. Orm import session maker. So this is going to make our async session. Engine class is going to be the async session, and it's gonna not expire on commit. So this will pretty much get our session here. So this function here is scriptable, meaning that you can use this in a script. This is kind of decoupled away from the project, so you don't need to run the app in order to use the database. So if you want to make like a script to insert stuff into the database, you would use this function. And our next function is going to be for FastAPI specifically in its dependencies. So it's going to be an async function, get session, and then it's going to return an async generator, an async session in it, and it's going to get the session base, right? And then it's going to yield it pretty much. So this is going to be our dependency, right? So we'll get into dependencies later on, but just note that this is for FastAPI routes specifically. So now we'll create some API endpoints to add, update, and delete a blog. So in our routers folder, right, we will make a directory called API, and then API will make a file called API blog. And in here, this is where we'll make /API/blog routes. So yeah, let's kind of copy from our blogs router some of the stuff that we need. So this, some other stuff I'll need is just like some typing stuff, right? And then we want from our client that we just made, we want to import get session. All right, and then so in API router, it's actually going to be /API/blog. And our tag is going to be like this. So our router here, we're going to want to do a create, not a get, it's a post. And just for simplicity's sake, I'll make everything post. So it's not going to return a HTML response. The default response in FastAPI is JSON. And you can kind of see that by peeking into the post, or anything in general, actually. Yeah, any one of these HTTP methods, you can see that the response class is pretty much going to be a default of JSON response. So yeah, back into our API. This is going to be API blog create. We're going to want 3 of these because we're going to want a create, an update, and then a delete. And this will also be changed as well. And don't think we need the requests as well. So this is just a really simple API currently. Here we'll add a dependency injection. And if you're not familiar with what dependency injections are, then I think there are better resources online that can explain better than what I can explain it as. But FastAPI's docs also has a very brief overview of what it is. First steps, I guess. Yeah, they kind of just briefly go over what it is, kind of give you like the first steps and examples as well. But for this video, it's going to be just a really quick explanation. I think looking at a language like C# might be more informative on what dependency injections are. Let's give an example here. And I guess we also need depends as well. So we don't need request. Get rid of this. We need templates. Okay. Yeah, this function will run once this endpoint gets hit. We're not creating the entire instance as we go inside here. The entire instance of this function is already loaded in this function. But just note that this is how dependency injections work in FastAPI, and this is how we use it. So now we also want to specify the payload we want, right? When a user wants to create a blog, we need the information of what they want to create. So we can make this in Pydantic's base model. So outside here, so inside models, right? Because it's a request model. Let's make a directory called request. And then in here, we will make a file called blog. And here's where our payloads will live. So something like blog create payload, right? So this payload is going to be used in blog create, and it's going to inherit the base model from Pydantic. So we're going to need that. And then we're also going to want validators. And also going to import optional, and that's good for now. So we want 3 different payloads, right? Because we want to create, update, and delete. We can start with delete first. Delete is just going to take an ID, which is an integer. So this is going to be the ID in our database. In our create payload, if you remember from our blog model, right, we have title, URL path. URL path will actually not be set by the user, but it's going to be auto-generated from our side. Your URL path will be optional. Title is a string. URL path is an optional string. And then we'll have a validator. I'll show this is validating title. And what I want to validate is, and if you haven't seen like my video on Pydantic and how it can validate, it's in my video list on this channel. But anyways, this is gonna check. So whatever the user passes in, which is v, is going to check if it's empty. If it's empty, it's going to raise something, right? And we'll make that something. And if not, it's going to just return v. It's also going to modify the title to title it, just in case the user makes it all lowercase. We want it titled. And this exception here, let's make the exception. From part 1, we made an exceptions folder, right? So we can see that we have a handler. We can make a directory called, not a directory, a file called classes. And then in classes, we will make a bad data exception. It's going to inherit exception. Yep, and then in init, it's going to have some details. And then in handler, in exceptions.handler, I can kind of show this outside. So this is from our previous project. We made a handler sorry, the previous video. This is our handler for any base HTTP exception. And in here, we'll make a new handler whenever it sees bad data exception handler. Need to import actually the bad data exception as well. So in here, it's going to return a JSON response status code is equal to 400 content. It's going to give a message of detail. We also need to import JSON response. So from FastAPI.responses import. So now that we have our new exceptions class and handler, every time we raise this exception here, it's going to handle it in here, which means that it's going to return a JSON response with the 400 code and our message content. So back to our models request. So our payloads, right? We're going to want to raise the bad data exception here. And it's going to take in a message, right? Something like blog title cannot be empty. Lastly, let's make the update, blog update payload. It's going to be like ID. The user is going to have to specify the ID of the blog. And then they're also going to need to specify like what they want to change the title to be. And then the URL path, again, is going to be auto-generated. So it's going to be an optional string. We also need to validate the title as well. So now that we have our payloads, we can map it to our router routes. So here, actually, let's make our request objects also from as a package in request, right? We have our blog, and then we're going to do the init thing like we did earlier. Import all of those three coming from blog from models dot request, import all of those three objects that we just made, or the payloads, right? We can ask each route to accept a payload that's mapped to our payload classes that we just made. So something like this, data is blog create payload, right? Now let's match all these payloads to their respective type. So what's happening here is that whenever the user, hits this endpoint with a post, they need to have the data that's correspondent to this payload. I can kind of just demo that really quickly. In our main.py, let's register our router. So from routers.api, import API blog. And here it's gonna include this, our API blog router. So let's run this app really quick. Our endpoint is localhost 8000 /API/blog 8000. And again, I'm using HTTP Pi as my API testing tool. You can use whatever you want. Postman is probably the more common one among devs. So yeah, as you recall, is like /API/blog/create, right? What I'm doing is returning the data, right? So it should return what I asked for, pretty much. So in create, if I do like title equals hello world, we should get back our data, right? And it will be titled as well. You can see our validator is working here, titling the lowercase title here. And yeah, so this handles validation just on a basic level as well. So say that it's not title, right? It's like a different name. It's going to give me back a 422 response. And it's going to give me the details on what's missing. And it's missing a title field, right? So yeah, let's go back to our routers. So back here, right? how I like to manage my database actions is pretty much to put everything in one location. And what I mean by that is that in our DB folder, we have the client, and anything I want to do when touching the database, I want to have a place called actions. So feel free to organize it however you want, but this is just the way I like to do it. So yeah, in actions, I want to make our init file because we're going to use this like a package. And then we're going to make our block.py file. And in here, I'm going to import some stuff that I think I'll need. I'm going to import HTTP exception. We're going to need the typing for the database. So session. We also need a selecting query statement. And then we're going to need our model as well. So in here, we're going to do something like a blog query class, right? And then we're going to need a create class. We're also going to want an update class. And lastly, the delete class. This file here is where all of our database actions will live. Anytime we want to interact with the database, we're going to interact it through here. And then everything is going to be located in one class, blog actions. This is going to be the base. And it's going to inherit all of these actions pretty much. So query, create, update, delete. And what the base is going to need is going to need a session, which is our database, which is a short-lived one, but this is just how I like to do things. And it's going to need to init each, the inherited class. So it's like that. And then we're going to need a function that sets the session because its lifetime is just in one request. So we're going to init it, we're going to set it like this. We're going to create our blog actions. Whenever we import this file, it's going to create this variable here that we can use throughout all of our project. So now we can start filling in our database actions and then use it from here whenever we call it. For typing purposes, we're going to need something like this. And then in query, I'm going to want they're all async. So get by ID, and then it's going to return a blog for sure. Let me just write up the code really quick and explain it afterwards. So yeah, what's going on here is that this execute function is going to return a list of blogs. Because this is async, we need to use this function here. And we're going to grab the first one. And this first is going to either return any or none. And then if it's not blog, we're going to raise the HTTP exception. And if there is a blog, it's going to return the blog. Next, let's create our blog create. Okay, so blog create, right? We're going to do a create, and it's also going to return the blog that we just created as well. So yeah, this is how we make a new model. It's going to take quarks, it's pretty much the payload, right? So if you look at the Quest model, it's going to be the payload of this. So this is going to contain title and URL path. And Pydantic has a function that lets you transform this model into a dictionary. So with that dictionary, we're going to pass it into the create function. And then it's going to expand dictionary into arguments. So just to kind of demonstrate it, it's going to be like title, my title, something like that, right? And then URL path, my title, dash title. So this is quarks right now, right? And what this expansion here does is pretty much title equals my title, URL path equals my title. So what that expansion does is pretty much this, so that it creates the blog in just one line. And then we add it to our session right here. And then we commit it, and then we refresh it, and then we return a blog. Next, let's create the update function. Okay, so our update function, kind of the same as here, except that we're going to take in the object, which is going to be the newly updated blog object. And so it's going to pretty much find the ID of the blog and see that it's the same thing, and then it's going to overwrite that blog. It kind of just does it automatically for us. Lastly, let's make our delete function. So our delete function, we take in the blog object. So this is like the entire blog object. We will probably get it with this query function. And pretty much it just, delete, save. That's pretty much it. And then it returns nothing pretty much. We can kind of like write notes to enhance the typing. So update here requires the updated blog object. So when we do update, we can see that there's a little note here that says that it requires the updated blog object, not the old one. So back into our router. So yeah, let's import actions. import our actions. Actually, let's list our actions first. So in actions, we need to import it like this from db.actions.log import log actions. So back to our router, we can import the actions directly. So from db.actions import log actions. And so now we can use our actions in our API. So what happens is that we want to set the session first, right? And then now we can use the actions. We actually need to make the URL path creator. So actually what I want to do here is go back to our utils. And in our utils, we're going to make a file called request.py. So it's a utility of request. Anything request related is going to live in here. Let's do a create URL path, and it's just going to need the title. The URL path is pretty much it's all lowercase, and then it replaces the spaces with dashes. It should also remove any special characters as well, I think, because it has to be URL safe. So yeah, what this does is pretty much lowercase the title, split it by space into a list. I kind of want to rename this stuff. So for each word, it's only going to be appended if each character of each word is alphanumeric. And then at the end, it's going to be joined by a dash for each word. Also, while we were in here, I kind of want to make that takes in a message, return JSON response. I mean, you can kind of just return like this in the FastAPI routes, but I just like to be more explicit and use a function by itself. Yep, back into our routers from utils dot request import success response and URL path. Yep, so let's, as I said before, we're going to make our URL path with the title. So URL path is going to be created with the function that we just made, and then we expect in the payload the title. And then now, if you remember, our payload here has an optional URL path, right? Because we were going to make it after we receive it. So here we can set URL path and data, URL path. And then here we can create our blog. We need to await it, blog actions.create. What this is the data.dictionary. Yeah, we need to expand it and then dictionary it. Yeah, we can just do a return, or sorry, the blog should be equals to this. And then we can return the success response that we just made. Message is equal to created blog.title. Okay, so next let's do the update. We can kind of just copy some of the code here. These three. So we need the new URL path from the data. What we're going to do is we expect from the payload the ID so that we can grab it, right? So it's going to be like blog is equal to, we're going to need to query it, right? So get by ID, data.id. And then in here, we're going to need to set the blog attributes to the new data. So for each key value pair in data.dictionary.items, we're going to set the attribute blogs attribute and then the new value. So now this blog item here, this blog model here is updated with the new attributes. Blog actions.update blog can return the success response, updated blog title. Yeah, we can just leave it like that for now, I guess. And then lastly, let's finish our delete blog session here. And in the payload here, we expect just the ID, right? So blog, we can grab the blog by the ID, get by ID. For the message, we're going to need the title. So we're going to do title equals blog.title. And then we can await blog actions.delete. Then we can return the response that we deleted blog, and then it's just going to be title. Okay, so now we have our entire API coded out. Now we can test our API. So let's run the app. And I kind of want to show what's going on in dbeaver as well. So this is our database, right? Nothing is in blogs right now. So our app is running. Yep, it's good to go. 8000 port /API/blog/create. All this needs is a title. So hello world. So we created the blog hello world. We can refresh the database and see that it has been created. It has the correct title, URL path, ID of 1, and created at timestamp. Next, let's update our blog. So this is update. Let's change the name to goodbye world. And then we need the ID as well, right? So ID is equal to 1. So now we updated the blog, right? So we can refresh the table and see that our data has been updated. And lastly, let's delete the blog. So delete only needs the ID. Delete. And it deleted the blog goodbye world. And it's gone. So our API is working perfectly. So let's recap today what we did. So in our agenda right here, we added an async SQLite database. This is our SQLite database, but it is using async. So with kind of obvious, but we do have an async SQLite database using the async SQLite interface. We added a migration tool called Alemic, right? So we created a script to kind of manage that. So we can migrate init, add, run, and revert. We created our blog model. So this is our blog model that's going to be keeping track of our blogs pretty much. And then we created the API or blog to create, update, and delete. As you can see here, we've tested it and it works. So next video will probably be working on our blog HTML generator and utilizing the API we made today. We'll be using Quill.js for text editor. So Quill.js, a little bit bright, sorry about that, but yeah, this is Quill.js. You can kind of like see how it works here. Hello world, you can make a heading, content, you can make it bold, stuff like that. I've chose this editor because it's the only one that I found to be able to insert and retrieve HTML. If someone has a better JavaScript text editor library that can do the same, then please tell me about it in the comments. Again, it must be able to retrieve the HTML from the editor and also insert or load the HTML from a blank template as well. But yeah, that was the second part of the semi-static blog tutorial. See you guys in part 3.